and welcome to ThinkJSOU, presented by the Office for Strategic Engagement. This panel will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that this session is unclassified and that the views and opinions expressed are entirely those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of NATO, the US government, US Department of Defense, Polish Ministry of National Defense, or USSOCOM. Moderating our panel today is Brian S. Petit. Brian is an adjunct lecturer for the Joint Special Operations University. He teaches JSOU's National Resistance course for US and international partners. Brian is a former US Army Special Forces colonel who retired in 2017 with command tours in the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Europe, and Africa. In 2013, Colonel Petit published Going Big by Getting Small, the application of operational art by Special Operations in Phase Zero. His book was on the U.S. Special Operations Commanding General's 2015 recommended reading list and is in use in both military and academic curricula. He's been published in Special Warfare, Military Review, Small Wars Journal, and War on the Rocks. Here's your panel moderator, Mr. Brian Petit.
Clarissa, thank you. Teammates, friends, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Brian Petit, and I have the honor of being the moderator today for a great panel. If you saw the screen that came up, JSOU is advertising this as an update on Ukraine. And is that an accurate title? I'm not sure exactly. I think what we did more is we sort of focused on who to bring in the panel. And we didn't necessarily, ask them to give us one specific thing. We really want to know what's on their mind. So you'll see that we have three very different and diverse panelists with diverse backgrounds. And we're going to let them really take a shot at what they think, we as a collective want to know about Ukraine. So of course, what do we want to know about Ukraine is if you're like me, on Monday, maybe you're looking at very tactical detail about frontline trace of units and the latest maneuver. Then maybe the next day you're looking at, the odds or probability of a nuclear strike. And then maybe the next day you're going back into history to understand something. Of course, we have our, East European, Black Sea, and NATO partners that, have a coming energy crisis or a winter in which they have to tighten their belts. We have food insecurity as a result of this. So there's just so many things here. We're not going to sweep them all up today, but we'll hear what's on the mind of our panelists. So with that, we will. Our order will be first will be Dr. Kevin Stringer. Second, we'll go to Yaroslav Jablonski, JJ, and then third we'll come in with Dr. Chris Marsh. I will read a quick bio, and then each panelist will have about 10 minutes to give us their thoughts. And so we'll go bio panelist, bio panelist, bio panelist. That'll give you about 30 minutes at the end to ask some questions in here and do some sort more free flow question and answer. So if everybody's happy with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our first panelist is Kevin Stringer. Dr. Kevin Stringer is a retired U.S. Army colonel, recently retired. He spent the past decade as a Eurasian Foreign Area Officer and an Army strategist. He's been in the Special Operations community for well over a decade. He has served as a military faculty member at the U.S. Army War College. In addition, he's an associate professor at the Military Academy of Lithuania, and he lectures at the University of Northwestern Switzerland, where I know Dr. Stringer also lives. Maybe on point here, in 2013, Dr. Stringer was at U.S. Special Operations Command Europe. He led the development team, which produced the resistance operating concept. So if you're on this panel, you certainly know what that resistance operating concept is. And among the the names that you should credit for that, Kevin Stringer is certainly one of the top. He's advised Ukrainian Special Operations Command, and in an earlier career, he has taught graduate students in Kyiv, Odessa, and Dnipro. He's published in Naval War College Review, Joint Force Quarterly, Military Review, Parameters, Special Operations Journal, Journal on Baltic Security. So, personally, I've come to know Kevin first through his work, and then personally, in fact, we've also worked overseas together. So, Kevin, Dr. Stringer, great to see you. Proud to have you on this panel. And with that, I will turn the floor over to you, Dr. Stringer.
Ryan, thank you very much for the welcome and the introduction. Welcome to all the participants. I hope to contribute to your thinking today on Ukraine. I'd like to offer 3 emerging thoughts on Ukraine as we look forward into the future. The first one is a careful need to actually study the Eastern Front experience from World War I, World War II, and the interwar period. I think this helps us better understand the current and future state of what we're seeing in this conflict. My second thought that I'll talk about is we need to have a long view to the conflict. We're talking about a campaign, an irregular warfare campaign that could go on for years. And thirdly, and importantly, the continuing and important role of special operations forces, and particularly the resistance activities that we might not see clearly currently, but what sort of impact those activities will have as we go forward in this conflict. So let me start with my first one. Probably most of us on this call are from the West. We study a lot about our own World War II experience, the Anglo-American experience. I would offer, though, that we need to study the Eastern Front experience from World War II, World War I even, as well as the interwar period. And there's some reasons for this, because there are some historical activities that are pertinent for today. I'll just highlight a few. Partisan operations, nothing new. Both the Soviets and the Ukrainians have a strong tradition in this. Russians have inherited the mantle of the Soviet Union, so they have a long history of conducting partisan operations on the very ground of Ukraine. I think that is very helpful to look at because there are several recurring themes that come up from these operations. Weather. It's October in Ukraine. Those of you who have been there, we have the mud season coming up. That has implications not only for combat operations, but also special operations. Logistics and critical nodes. Kherson and Mariupol have been in the news lately, both critical cities. These were also critical cities in World War II. When you do a careful study of the literature, a number of these cities and locations show themselves to be operationally important. My question is, do we understand that? For this first point, in terms of our own self-development education on Ukraine, I'd offer a couple of thoughts for the audience. You probably need to read the 6-volume series by Prit Buttar, which looks at the Eastern Front from 1914 to 1922. I'd recommend the book, the last one that looks at 1917 to 1921, which talks a lot about this emerging nation called Ukraine. There's the classic by Alfred Seaton, Russo-German War, 1941 to 1945. History doesn't repeat itself, but there's several rhymes in that book that play out today and in the future. And then for your information warfare types that are on the call, 2 books by Serhiy Plokny. The Origins of the Slavic Nations give a lot of insight into the narratives that Mr. Putin is twisting currently. I think in order to think carefully about the narratives, we need to have this context that goes back to the pre-modern period. So that's my first point. I'm recommending for this long war, deeper and greater study of the Eastern Front, World War I, interwar period, and World War II. Point number 2, I think we need to have a long view to the conflict. My personal assessment, having been in Ukraine, having been heavily involved in the region in the past almost 15 years, the conflict will go on unless there's a regime change in Russia. Russian atrocities of rape, mass execution, war crimes will not lend themselves to an easy peace. And having worked closely with the Ukrainians in a civilian capacity, the Ukrainian culture is not one of forgiveness. These war crimes and these atrocities will be long remembered as part of their cultural narrative. And I don't think any Ukrainian leader can actually accede to Russian demands. It could be politically dangerous for that person's government. Zelensky is currently the leader, but a negotiated outcome would be very difficult if he has to give something up. So what does that mean for the special operations community? We need to prepare for a long campaign going beyond 2023. It's probably a 3 to 5 year campaign, as we learn in the Joint Force, and it's most likely an irregular warfare campaign because the outcomes for a conventional war are deadly for all of the involved. My last point concerns the role of special operations in the conflict. Currently, Ukrainian soft and resistance efforts, they're occurring. They're very opaque. There's not a lot of information coming out of the occupied territories. But the very existence of Ukrainian resistance, I think, does two things. First, the Ukrainian resistance will be helpful for deterrence in the future. If you think about our allies in the Baltics, also Poland, they've worked with the United States, particularly SOCOM, for over a decade on resistance planning. The Russian experience in Ukraine, this very high level of valor, this high level of resistance, I believe will contribute to a cost calculation that actually enhances the deterrence for the Baltics and other countries. I'll repeat that. I think the second order effect is Ukrainian valor and resistance operations actually will benefit the others who have planned for and prepared for this. Would be open for questions on this particular, this assertion. The second point I think is quite critical. Ukrainian resistance to invasion and resistance to occupation is extremely valuable for our own education. And I think we, and I'm speaking collectively, not only for DoD, but also JSOU, the various war colleges, we should be thinking about how we import the Ukrainian real world experience into our education programs. And that could range from the war college to the actual qualification course for our special officers and NCOs. They've actually done this. And the sooner we can get them on the platform to help us start thinking about it, I think it'll do two things. It'll help us understand the adversary, what works, what doesn't. It will also help shift us from a counter violent extremist force to one that is really dealing with a great power. So this cross-fertilization from Ukrainian soft and their experiences in resisting, they quickly become the instructors. And I think we should be thinking about how do we integrate those lessons learned into our curriculum sooner rather than later. So I'm going to stop there. My 3 points: more focused education on the Eastern Front experience, preparing for a long IW campaign, and this second order effect of Ukrainian resistance helping deterrence, but also giving us the opportunity to actually profit, educate ourselves on what works and what doesn't with the Russian adversary. I'll stop there. Brian, back over to you. Looking forward to the Q&A.
Yeah, perfect. Dr. Stringer, thanks for those remarks. Points 1, 2, and 3. In the forum, folks, I'm going to move it on to JJ now. But if you've got a question that you want to ask Dr. Stringer, go ahead and load that up in chat. And Dr. Rob Burrell at JSOU is actually going to triage those, and then we'll swing back to Dr. Stringer, and we'll make sure we collect those up. So with that, I'd like to move across the Atlantic to Poland, where we've got Jaroslaw Jablonski, who goes by JJ. He's a colonel in Polish Special Forces since 2002. He's also a PhD. So maybe when they say we want Special Forces to be, a PhD that can win a bar fight, I think that might be JJ. Who knows? Maybe you could challenge him at a bar next time you see him there. Colonel Jablonski, he has an MA in Defense Analysis from U.S. Naval Postgrad School, 2009. He's got his PhD in Information and Knowledge Management. He's got about over 40 months of deployment time to places like the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, in support of ISAF. And for those of you that are Tampa-based, you will know him down there. He's a man about town in Tampa as the Polsoff Exchange Officer in SOCOM. So JJ, with that, looks like you're up, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much for inviting me to this great panel and for very important topic for all the Poles right now, not only for the Poles, but I would say right now for around the world. what's going on right now in the Ukraine. So thank you very much. This is my grand honor to be between the panelists and the great panelists with you, and also for to have the chance to talk to our audience. So let me start like this for my show introduction. Being the Slavic nation, to some degree, we have to understand Ukrainians and Russians much better than any other nation around the world. That's true. So this is the reason that what Russia, I would say, the Kremlin regime, I would say, doing right now is no surprise for us. So we spoke about this for centuries. Looking back for the last 1 decade, we spoke about this to rest of the European Union and European nation, that Russia is still was going to play with the Ukraine, other nation on the eastern flank. It's nothing new, and we have to be prepared. So fortunately, the United States, NATO was aware about it, and we make some kind of precautions. So what we see right now in Ukraine, this is some kind of this is the result of this. It's not the proper word, investment, but the good job which did the United States, DOD and USSOCOM, NATO. I think that additionally, Ukrainians take the additional lessons from 2014 until now, until February, and the result which you see right now in Ukraine. This is exactly the fruits of this activity. I mean, the NATO and US investment plus a very smart campaign led by the Ukraine leadership. What I want to highlight in my introduction, let's say about some kind of strategic context. First of all, Russia didn't achieve any single goal, I would say, because what we can estimate in Poland, one of the goals, Russian goals, was to eliminate the regular Ukraine forces. Not happen. We try to control all the Ukraine cities like the Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnieper. We didn't. Russian tried to capture all Ukraine critical infrastructure. Except of the Zaporozhye nuclear thermal power station, we didn't make so much in order to occupy main critical Ukraine infrastructure. We tried to establish the pro-Russian central government. Not happened. We tried to disintegrate Ukraine territory. Of course, we occupy, let's say, the 18-20%, but not happen. What happened for the Russians? We can say that we faced the heavy economic sanctions. For us as a Poles, we can see that everything what the Putin regime doing, it only enhance the security and the defense cooperation in Europe right now. So I would say the NATO is stronger right now than any time before. We can see this in Poland. Let's say about the enlargement of the NATO, like the Finland and Sweden is on the way to the NATO because the Russian activity. We can see also the hostile neutrality of Turkey. Turkey closed the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. Moreover, we start to spend and deliver the assault drones to Ukraine. This is also a good sign. And what is most important for us as a Poles, Russian aggression accelerate transition of Ukraine forces for, I would say, to the NATO standards. This is the very good point. So I think just like the Dr. Stringer said, in our part of the Europe, like Poland or Ukraine, when you look back for the history, we learned by the pain and blood many times from the Russian side. So we shouldn't understand Russians from 0 to 100%. We know them because we have the similar characteristic like we have. So this means that whatever we want to do in the future, military, economically, or politically, probably will not surprise for us. We want to act. Probably we can see escalation ladder who is moving up very quickly. But Ukrainians I think are prepared right now much better than the 8 years ago, and we take the lesson from them as well. In order to sharing the best lesson learned from the Ukrainians to the rest of the partners and allies, I think this is only the question of time when whenever we collect more information, more lesson learned over the tactical level, we share this pretty quickly. I'm 100% sure. And we can see pretty soon the Ukrainians are the most experienced nation in terms of the action against Russia, the fighting with the Russian style of the war. So I'm happy very happy what Ukrainians make in terms of the progress with the forces, with the development of the forces. But we cannot stop to reinforce the Ukrainian forces. I give the one example. The last counterattack which took place for the last 4 or 5 weeks, I think the leadership of Ukraine and Ukraine forces show the world, especially the West Europe, before the winter, that we really want to fight, understand what is on the stage, and we don't want to spend, we don't want to lose the terrain in a simple way. I think this is very good, strong message to the world. We have to support them, just like the Polish government, not only doing all the time, and US government and the UK government, one of the main free government who support Ukraine. But again, Ukraine show by the counter operation in the northeast part of the Ukraine that were very valuable forces, very valuable nation, and we have to support them, not stop. We cannot stop this process. Thank you very much.
Excellent. JJ, thank you for those thoughts. And again, if you're in the audience and you would like to lay a question down for JJ, then drop that into chat and we'll scoop that up and we'll circle back on some of his thoughts and comments. With that, I'll push to Dr. Chris Marsh, who is south of Tampa in Miami, if I got my geography right, and he's displaced from his home as a result of Hurricane Ian. So he gets a pass today that he's not in a suit and tie because he hasn't had power and he probably hasn't eaten. With that, Dr. Marsh, you did show up today to be with us, and the floor is yours, sir.
What, no intro?
Great. Oh gosh, I was so struck by your picture there. I went right to you. So Dr. Chris Marsh, so for those of you who wondered, I've known Chris Marsh a long time, so I don't need his intro, but geez, we do as a group. Dr. Marsh is he is a teammate at JSOU. He's the director of the Department of Research and Analysis at the Institute of Soft Strategic Studies. He conducts research on global special operations forces with a particular focus on Russian SOF, including strategy and foreign policy. And let me editorialize here. He's not new to this. He's been looking at this, since long before the GWOT was with us. So Dr. Marsh is a long look type academic and practitioner. He serves as the editor of Special Operations Journal. Prior to heading down to JSOU, he was a professor of national security and strategic studies at the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies. By the way, that's where I met him formally. I was a fellow down there, and everybody knew Dr. Marsh, and I got to become friends and colleagues with him at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He's got a PhD in political science from the University of Connecticut, completed graduate study at Moscow State University, and conducted much of his dissertation research at the Russian Academy of Science. He was later a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at Boston University. In addition, Dr. Marsh has also studied in China. So while, I sort of see you, Dr. Marsh, as as a, let's say, Russia expert. I also know that you are really a sort of a great power competitor or strategic competition, academic, in that he also looks at political and social change in China. Dr. Marsh has written 5 books, co-authored, with many people, and perhaps some on this forum, and he's published in more than 70 journal articles and chapters. So he's my go-to guy when I want to know what is happening with Russia. So I'm always reading his stuff. And with that, I'm happy to introduce you, Dr. Marsh, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, Brian. Not to, wow, that was a heck of an intro, but I appreciate it. I just wanted to make sure I got people know who I am, who are not familiar with me, and know that I've been working on this problem set for more than a minute. So you asked me this morning, what's on my mind? Several things are on my mind. The first thing really is the less than a week long annexation of Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye. Of course, the Ukrainians are not recognizing this. We are not recognizing this, but the Russians believe that they have annexed these territories and integrated them into the Russian Federation, much like they did with Crimea, though this is not going to go down the same way as Crimea did. I think now is when the irregular warfare phase in resistance phase is going to begin in those territories. It's true, they lost a large number of the population in those regions to evacuation, something you mentioned regarding me, but my evacuation is not a big deal compared to theirs. I'm just waiting for power to come back on in the Tampa region. They're waiting for their lives to return to normal, and for the Russian invaders to go back home, which is the goal. And another recent development that I've been thinking about is the mass mobilization, or the mobilization of some 300,000 troops, or I should say 300,000 Russian male citizens who are trying to be converted into troops in a period of a few days to a week. Most of them are being given substandard equipment. They don't know how to shoot, move, communicate together. They don't even know how to operate their equipment from some of the videos I'm seeing. They are average Russians who have had some training in the past and are now being sent to the front line, to quote one general, as fodder. That's their own generals calling them cannon fodder. That's sort of unbelievable. But in the Russian war against Ukraine, there's a war of aggression. It is not unbelievable. It is kind of par for the course, which is very, very sad to say. They're also fleeing in large numbers. Some say about half of the people who have been mobilized have tried to flee, either by air or by car or by rail, getting stopped at the border in the latter cases, trying to get into Kazakhstan and into Georgia. And the irony that exists with the 2008 war against Georgia, that same road is now being used for Russians to flee into Georgia. And like I said, being stopped at the border or let in. The Baltics have a no entry policy, not letting Russians in who are fleeing. The wisdom of that is something we should talk about. I think it's something to think about. Should we let them in as political exiles, or do we hold fast and say no? And the reason one of the reasons we should say no is because we want to see Putin removed from power and the war brought to an end. And one way to do that is through protests. And these are the people who have the most to lose. So in some ways, it's the protest potential is declining if, in fact, the people who are most likely to protest are trying to evacuate. Then there's Putin and the elites. What does this signal to the elites of Russia, those who have been supportive of Putin up to this point? I think that there's going to be a great decline in support for Putin, especially as the Ukrainians make successes in the Kupiansk and Mariupol and Kherson regions, moving into the newly annexed territories. As that occurs, and I think it's likely to continue to occur, that the Ukrainians will continue with their regular warfare that Dr. Stringer is talking about, while also engaging in conventional warfare, a kind of hybrid, if you will. And I know that term's been way overused, but in this context, we're talking about both the regular warfare and irregular techniques and tactics in combination with conventional warfare, with artillery, armor, and so forth. So those are some of the things I'm looking at. But I found it very interesting that Ukraine is already beginning, they've been very good with their information operations. And JJ, I'm sure, would want to jump in on this at some point, given his background. They came out with a video over the weekend in Russian to the Russians and said, many of your brothers have died here and are now fertilizing our soil. You're welcome to join them, but these were professionally trained soldiers. You are not. And the chances of you standing to gain victory against us is, ridiculous. Turn around and go back home or surrender. But if you must come on and fight, we're prepared to engage you. That would give me pause if I were a Russian conscript who has just been drawn into this conflict myself. And Zelensky came out as well, President Zelensky, speaking in Russian to the audience, and said pretty much the same thing, but in more diplomatic and political terms. And then, of course, as been alluded to, it's October. This is not the thaw season. This is the freezing season, where at night it freezes, in the morning it starts to thaw, and it's mud by the afternoon. Not very good for moving howitzers, not good for moving artillery in general, not good for armor. And it's just going to get worse until it freezes over completely, and then it will become a battlefield, but it will not become a good or pretty battlefield, not one that is likely to see a lot of mass movement, mass mobilization of forces. But I leave that to you military experts. I'm more of a higher level operational art, strategic environment guy. From that level, we can talk about the nuclear capabilities that Russia has and the likelihood of nuclear engagement. I really hope I read Putin correctly in that he is threatening to use nuclear weapons, but that he's not really mentally prepared to. But I've seen some open source movement on nuclear boomers, nuclear carrying submarines, and these are disconcerting to say the least, up in the Kola Peninsula and so forth, up north. And I hope these are just political jockeyings to scare the West, and hopefully they won't work, and hopefully that's all they are. But I think with the winter coming, we also have the food insecurity crisis and energy crisis that we're likely to see. These are things on my mind, and like as everyone in the panel has said, but in particular Dr. Stringer, this is not a short battle. It is a long-term campaign, and a 5-year window is probably a good window to put on it. And we need to be thinking about how these campaigns go on, and think about the role of resistance, and resistance in particular in the Russian occupied territories, because that's likely where we're going to see true resistance operations taking place. And those are my initial thoughts, and I'll leave it there. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, Dr. Marsh, perfect. Appreciate that. We're sort of right on the mark, right on time, leaving time for lots of questions, and I'm going to get right to them. Dr. Stringer, first, I'm gonna take these from the audience. These are not my own questions, so I'm scooping them up in chat. Dr. Stringer, you had said you felt that the conflict was going to trend toward IW, and then Dr. Marsh, later you also felt that, you know, we were moving into the resistance phase. The question came in from the audience here is, let's start with you, Dr. Stringer. Please elaborate on why you believe the conflict will trend toward irregular warfare going forward. This seems to defy the current trend. Kevin.
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, the future is speculative. I think, though, that Dr. Marsh highlighted with the recent annexations of additional territory, you've just created new occupied Russian governed territory. I think you're going to see more irregular warfare operations, and we can talk about what that exactly means, but I would not discount the conventional side. This is not a binary. The conventional fight will continue, and then that implies, you know, how does soft and or resistance forces coordinate, liaison, and work with the conventional Ukrainian forces. So I wouldn't want to be misconstrued. I think IW will take on increased significance, but we will still see a very nasty conventional fight, particularly that we're coming now into the winter season, and given atrocities, this will not bode well for members of either side. Chris, maybe you want to comment further.
No, I think that was great, Kevin. You said exactly what I would have said, and pointed to the one thing, which is now that there's been true annexation, it's time for the insurgency to begin and rise up. We've been seeing mostly conventional fight. That's the current trend that the question asker was referring to. I think the conventional fight will continue, as you said, but the irregular context, irregular conflict is going to begin at a new stage, a stage that will see IW increasing in significance, increasing in pace, and I agree with you 100%. So I'll just leave it there.
JJ, any comments on that question?
I am, of course, agree with the Dr. Stringer and the Chris said. Definitely, we can see the well-developed unconventional warfare from Ukraine side. You know, I am sure that we prepare ourselves for such a course of action long before the conflict. When you look back for the history again, Ukrainians, just like Poles, we have the long history of on resistance. So of course, the nature of the unconventional warfare and resistance is changing in 21st century, which moves swift this kind of activity more for the urban areas. However, I think that Ukrainians even think about it to stop to develop the unconventional warfare in terrain which will be occupied, I hope temporarily by the Russians. So we can see that we have very good support from auxiliary forces in this terrain, because we cannot say that 100% of the people who is living in the Donbass or the Lugansk are the pure Russians. So there are many Ukrainians experienced soldiers who grow up in this terrain, and I think this is a very good baseline to make Russian occupation there very difficult, even on the 5 years window. Whenever this occupation will be longer, we can think that the resistance will be even stronger. But what we cannot forget about it, whenever Ukrainians choose different tactics or operation against Russia, will be the unconventional or the regular warfare, we have to support both of way. Thank you.
Okay, appreciate that. Let's stay on that topic of let's say the long war, right? I've heard 3 to 5 years, 5 years. You know, we don't see any sort of there's no obvious off ramps here. Dr. Marsh talked about maybe Dr. Marsh, maybe it was Dr. Stringer. You know, it might take regime change, right, in Russia to sort of, you know, cause this to end. Let's shift to a question from the audience on that topic, and it has to do with foreign volunteers. Question is, how have the foreign volunteers, you know, in the international legions, let's call them, integrated into the Ukrainian army? Are they useful and capable, or, you know, is this more hype? And is it, you know, are they getting more media attention than they deserve? So I will, you know, again, that's this question, I'm tying it into the long war because, as many of you know, Russia's what, 145 million, Ukraine's about 40 million. So the numbers are grossly in favor of the Russian Federation, but there are a lot of foreign volunteers there. Are they making a difference? Let me start with you, Dr. Marsh, and then we'll go JJ and then Dr. Stringer.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks for the question. That's a very good question. I think we need to break it down. What do we mean by foreign fighters? Are we talking about the Legion, those who are trying to join, come in onesies and twosies and join up with the Ukrainian military? I think they're probably getting more attention than they are giving contributions to the fight. Not to downplay them at all. But groups like the Mozart Group, I think they absolutely are having an impact where they are not engaging in conflict themselves, but are training up special operations forces and conventional forces in a variety of locations and in different training programs where they assess them and try to you know, increase their battlefield capacity and expertise in quick time. I think what the Mozart Group is doing is very significant and is underestimated by the Western media. But I'll leave it there and let my colleagues jump on that.
Okay, this is my time right now. I can
Yeah,
add
go ahead,
to
JJ.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you, Brian. I can add to the Chris. I'm 100% agree with what you said. You know, this is difficult to say about the contribution. I think there is. I'm sure there is for the foreign fighters or the foreign legion, which fighting together with the Ukrainians. I think this the most important aspect is that this is the big information operation against Russia. If Russia are using the Kadyrov and his team against the Ukrainians, I think Ukrainians can show the international subject matter expert who want voluntarily help them. This means this is the big information campaign which is used by the President Zelensky team very well. The foreign legion, not only by the fight, this is the big information operation against Russian propaganda. That's my point.
So this question of foreign volunteers is an important one. First of all, it's very controversial. I would offer a couple things. It's not a new phenomenon. Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, we had international brigades, foreign volunteers fighting on both sides of the Spanish Civil War. So not a new phenomenon. It was controversial then, it's controversial now. If the expertise is right, so kind of what Dr. Marsh was saying, if you have experts and specialists that can help the Ukrainians, a foreign volunteer is great. But I currently perceive it, and I live in Europe, and I hear kind of Europeans talking about it, it's unhelpful. One colleague, an academic colleague who's not an American, said, these foreign volunteers, they provide the Russians with hostages and narrative, the whole fascist narrative. So controversial and probably not as helpful as it's being played up to be. So I'm rather against it from my position here in Europe, because I think it's maybe more helpful for the Russians and the Ukrainians. This may change over time, as Dr. Marsh alludes to, if specialists go in to help the Ukrainians, that could be very useful. But what I've seen is these are not specialists. They might be brave, but they don't really bring the expertise needed. So a controversial topic to be further discussed.
Great. That's a great sweep. For those of you who read The Atlantic, it was an article in there, but I think it was Graham Allison, pretty reputable, foreign policy writer, who I think around March said that you know, foreign volunteers should not go to Ukraine. It will you know, delegitimize, right, that this is a Ukrainian fight. And I have to say that I feel that in March I disagreed with that. It's interesting to hear your thoughts, Dr. Stringer, because in some ways I've been siding on the side that foreign volunteers actually legitimize it, right? It's still Ukrainian fight. nobody's really saying that this is a foreign fight, except for it's going to get funneled into Russia propaganda. But I think we do know this, right? No matter what we do, it's going to get funneled into Russian propaganda, and therefore, is the addition of 16 to 20,000 additional fighters with special skills, if they have special skills, is that helpful? I mean, I think I'm toggling on the side of yes. So it's interesting to hear that you might be toggling on the side of no from that European perspective. So good question, and we're not going to get resolution on that, but if this is a 3 to 5 year fight, let's see how the Mozart Group and the International Legion and other foreign volunteers or foreign fighters put their finger on the scale. Okay, let's shift. I'm going to take a question. I want to focus on let's go up to the Russian Federation. Dr. Marsh, I'll let you sweep this one first, and then we'll go to JJ and Dr. Stringer. How much support does Vladimir Putin have today with the FSB and the army? At what point, will he lose his support, if he loses support? Dr. Marsh.
Sorry, it took me a second to get my button unmuted. Great questions. I wish we had the answers to these. I wish we had solid statistics. The Levada Center has been coming out and still doing surveys on the trust in Russian politicians and trust in Russian institutions. So that's all available. And it seems over 50% is still supportive of the operation and support of Putin in particular. But I believe this data is about 2 or 3 weeks old. So the things that have happened over the past 3 weeks, the annexation, the turn of events really in the pocket up in Izium. I don't know if that was caught by and I don't know if that even makes its way into the news cycle in Russia, but actually I do know it has. Now that I say that, I've been watching the Russian news, and they are surprised by what they're seeing, and they have to stick to the party line, if you will, the Putin line, we'll call it. And I think that they were surprised to see Ukrainians with the win up in Izium and the progress that's being made in the southern front of Ukraine near Kherson. I think it all hinges on this person's question. When does the FSB stop supporting Putin? When does the army stop supporting Putin? And I think the army might be on the fringe of it now, on the verge of giving up support, because the fact is, Putin is trying to micromanage this war as if he were a field commander. And we know from Russian history, as Dr. Stringer pointed out, history certainly rhymes here. It sounds a lot like Stalin trying to engage in World War II. I don't think that bodes well for him, especially as losses come in and they could be attributed to Putin. But great question. And I think the Levada Center, the data they put out gives us some of the best insight into that. But beyond the data and the problems with the statistics, which obviously there are, leads us just to wonder what the answer to that question is. And I'm with that person who asked the question. I'm wondering myself. So I'll leave it there. Over.
Dr. Stringer, can you pick up anything on there? And maybe you could tie that into 1917, the collapse of, the sort of Russian army. Do you see parallels there?
See less parallels with 1917. In fact, I think I'm very careful on this question, because the FSB and army support to Putin, they're part of the regime. It's a security forces regime. I'll mispronounce the Russian, but the Siloviki regime, I think, is the right word. If Putin loses the support, whoever replaces him is also part of the same regime. So how much will they really change? They might stop the war, but then you've got to ask yourself, will the outcomes be satisfactory to the Ukrainians? So I've also read, and this comes from some non-US perspectives in Eastern Europe, they've said, be careful. If Putin loses the support, maybe someone like Kadyrov, who's the Chechen leader, those of you who are aware of him, maybe he comes into power. I'm not sure that would be a happy situation for any of us. So this question of when he loses support, these people supporting him are part of the regime. They might replace him with someone equally challenging. So I'm also thinking a lot like Chris about this, but changing Putin doesn't change the regime approach to Ukraine, would be how I would offer a thought to.
Yeah, interesting thought. A bit like the Algerian revolution, right? A few years ago, was it Bouteflika, right? He gets thrown out. And what happens? The entire Siloviki, as you said, right? The sort of apparatchiks and the apparatus, it stays in place. The next guy that comes in sort of placates the revolutionaries, but nothing changes. So it's a fake revolution of a sort. And so it's a great point, Kevin, which is, are you having a revolution of one or a revolution of the whole upper strata? And I think that's a question I'm looking to people to answer and comment on as well. JJ, any thoughts? Any thoughts on this FSB Putin army question?
A couple points. First of all, in Poland, we can say that we are not thinking about change the situation when the Putin lose his position. We can see different situation. We are not looking for this like so much. Just like the Dr. Stringer said. We don't think so that changing the Putin changed the situation. We have to understand that this is very unique situation about the Russian leadership construct. During the communist time, we have the political office, political bureau, which was the group of the people who lead the country, and secret services were under very control. Of course, there was one leader who lead the country, but was the decision was made by the team. There are many fractions was inside the political bureau. Now we have a very unique, dangerous situation because there's one man who leading the country for more than 2 decades, and he's leading the secret service, which is direct him without any kind of control. I would say it's a very dangerous situation. What I want to say additionally. We have to be more concentrate about all the processes which take place in Russia after mobilization, because I think that mobilization started many inside Russian processes which cannot be controlled even by the leadership of Russia, whoever will be right now. Of course, these forces which mobilize probably will change, reshape a little bit front line. However, inside the Russia, we can observe pretty soon a lot of processes which I hope change the leadership of Russia, who will understand the place where Russia is right now, which looks like that he's isolated week by week from international community.
Okay, JJ, thanks for the cleanup on that. I want to shift from talking about, let's say, Putin and Russia, and let's talk about us, NATO. So there's a few questions on NATO. I'm going to combine it, which is NATO's, let's say, I think the conventional wisdom is NATO's response out of the gate has been very strong for a non-NATO partner, right? NATO being 30 nations with 2 new applicants. What do we see NATO's role going forward? Can NATO sustain as a happy family moving forward? In the next sort of 12 to 24 months, or is this sort of campaign of attrition and exhaustion going to show fractures in the NATO family? Let me start with you, JJ. I'll go to Dr. Stringer and then Dr. Marsh.
I represent the country who apply to be the member of the NATO. I represent the country who dream about to be in the NATO. Not to be the member of the funny club and happy club, to be the solid nation who tried to fill up the gap after the communists and be the strong pillar of the NATO. We understand the value of the NATO, and I think if we don't take all applicants for the NATO, all the opponents, our adversaries, I don't want to pinpoint which one, everybody understand, fill up this gap pretty quickly. If we don't take care about the Finland, Sweden, to someday Ukraine, other big countries, adversaries, fill up this gap pretty quickly. So, you know, I'm not the political scientist, but politics don't like the gaps or the empty spaces. Pretty soon will be filled up by our opponents. So what we can see, as I said at the beginning, Ukraine war make NATO stronger. We have still a lot of homework, but I see that at least we talk about everything at one voice until today. We can see what happened for the next 2-3 years, but I think that we have no other choice if we be stronger, improve our interoperability, and look at for us as a strong pillar, not only look for the America who help us in our own problems. So we are NATO, and we have to push this NATO on the proper way, because this is the defense organization, not just like the Russian think about it. And it's probably not other way. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a powerful answer from one of obviously you know, one of the larger economies and larger military forces in NATO. Of course, JJ doesn't represent, let's say, the Polish government, right? Exactly here, he's representing himself and his ideas, but that's a very powerful answer. Dr. Stringer.
So the Russian actions, as JJ said, have created a very strong and unified NATO with 2 additional members who are very capable, Sweden and Finland. However, I think NATO has 2 major challenges facing them as we go forward. This has a type of a future perspective, this whole discussion today. One is the upcoming winter. There is tremendous division within the EU as well as NATO over what happens when the countries that are members who are heavily dependent on Russian gas, when the gas is turned off, and it will be turned off. This will create a lot of political problems and backlash at the domestic level that could affect NATO and NATO planning and operations. So NATO's got to be thinking now, how will they address that? And I'm going to call the countries out. I mean, Germany's a major NATO member, but they have a major domestic political issue if the winter's cold and there's lack of energy. So I think that's challenge 1 for NATO. Longer term, and I'm happy we're having this session on Ukraine today, is what I would call maintaining media and political focus. So I just happened to scan the US news today and no one's talking about Ukraine. Can we maintain that focus in this long campaign? And I think that'll be a challenge, not only in the United States, but in general. And NATO should think about that. How are they going to keep Ukraine at the forefront of member thinking? Not easy in the news age that we currently have. So with those 2 challenges, not easy, but if NATO can mitigate those risks, I think it will work out well for this longer war.
Dr. Marsh.
These are the 2 greatest experts on NATO that I know, and certainly on the panel, but I'll add from the Russian perspective what's not been said, and that is Russia views itself as at war against NATO, not against Ukraine. And they say that that NATO is willing to fight down to the last Ukrainian, and that, you know, this is the war that's going on, that they're fighting against NATO, and the United States has limited stakes in it, and its stakes are limited to what the Ukrainians can put up as a fight. Again, it's Russian information operations and their propaganda, but I believe that NATO is like you said, it's a non-partner state that we're supporting, but it's the right thing to do. So I'm all for supporting NATO, giving support to Ukraine and helping it fight a war that was a war of aggression by its neighbor, and to try to survive this horrible conflict.
Okay, let me stay on that theme and pull in some of the questions that are coming in from the audience, and I'm going to sort of combine 2. We are talking about what is NATO's will to sustain, right? And there's a cold winter coming, and energy is going to get cut off, presumably. And Putin has done what Putin does when he's cornered. He doubles down. He's called for a general mobilization, and he is signaling to his population that he is in for the long fight. So I'll start with you, Dr. Marsh. The question is, how does this, you talked about the mobilization and some of the problems, and I think we know that, right? This mobilization is a bit of a gambit, but how does the Russian Federation's mobilization of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, how does that impact the intensity of the fighting in Ukraine? And is NATO as an external supporter to Ukraine up to the challenge of responding to that?
I think it remains to be seen how this is going to affect the battlefield. If Russian soldiers who were trained and under contract and they're of their own volition were willing to drop their weapons and surrender or to try to blend into the Russian population, I don't have high hopes for what the mobilized forces are going to be capable of. Granted, there's 300,000 of them, 150,000 probably have fled. There could be riots among them. I've seen fighting videos of them fighting against even the police officers that are trying to just shuffle them onto buses and get there. I'm not sure it's going to be the same thing as putting, trained, mobilized, highly motivated reservists into the fight. So I don't have a big fear in that regard. Is NATO up to the fight? Yeah, I think it is. We're going to have to continue to give more support, material, personnel, training and equipping. Again, more of the Mozart group type, more of soft training, special operations forces in Ukraine, more IMET. I know this is because if it's going to be a 3 to 5 year fight, then it does make sense to take people out of Ukraine, train them in third-party countries on different weapon systems, get them back into the country with those weapon systems. So I think NATO is certainly up for the fight that it is engaged in and preparing to engage in.
Dr. Stringer, why don't you, or do you like to address that? And then JJ, will go to you.
I mean, my response is short. I agree with Chris. I think NATO is up to it. The question is, though, once the war becomes frozen, so meaning that the battle lines kind of stabilize, it becomes a war of attrition, what does that imply for NATO activities? Equipment's good, but equipment's probably insufficient. So education, IMET was mentioned. How does SOF, for example, do train, advise, and assist outside of the country? Are we going to be allowed in the country? That's a US decision, but how far is NATO willing to move into Ukraine to do that? While at the same time not becoming a direct party to conflict. These are some of the things I think NATO's got to work through, but they're certainly capable to persist here.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm glad you scooped up that. It's been on my mind too, which is NATO's policy is not static, right? Right now, they're sort of supporting from, East Europe and the Black Sea, but it doesn't mean that they could not move, forward into secure areas at some point. So I appreciate you scooping that up. JJ, I want to ask you that question, and could you also maybe, JJ, give us some idea about what it's like in Poland? I mean, Poland is the country that has received more refugees, right? You have more Ukrainians on your soil. Is there a compassion fatigue or a humanitarian crisis? And will this eventually cause, let's say, domestic problems or even financial problems inside Poland and or NATO? Over to you.
Thank you very much for this question. It's a very good question. I think that we show the world that by opening our borders for the more than almost 4 million refugees through Ukraine, that we show our hospitality, the Slavic hospitality. So this is the nice words. However, the Ukrainians help us a lot, from early stage. Our government make very good steps forward. We gave them the just like that, we call it in American social security number. We can start quickly. So we fill up, I would say, maybe just not the proper diplomatic words, but we fill up the gaps in our labor power. I mean that those people include Ukrainians who leave the Ukraine. We didn't create any kind of crisis in Poland. We start to work even the second, third day. in Poland, in tourist business and in restaurants, in many other places. We didn't have problem with them because we are Slavic, so so some of the part of the Poland we have the same religion, Orthodox religion, so that all things matter, and we include them to our society without the problems. So we can hear from time to time that we can see what will be our opinion for the next 12, 18 months where we have the problem with the energy. I would say that nobody think that way, that we can stop to support Ukrainians, even when you move in more numbers to Poland. Because again, the difference between the Ukraine refugees and the immigrants, let's say for the Arabic countries, which we had the problem a couple months before the war in Ukraine on Belarus border, is significant. So most of the people from Ukraine, from the Arabic countries moving to the West Europe, create the internal problems inside the European Union and the NATO countries, because frankly speaking, we're looking only for the social. In Poland, when we have the Ukrainians, those people, we don't need to push them to any kind of work. We start to work, we understand their place, and I don't think that the bigger number of the Ukrainians don't create any kind of problems inside the Poland or the European Union. What I want to add, when we think about all Russians, males who leave the country in order to avoid mobilization, that is the probably problem. That could be the problem for our governments in European Union, because I think that some of these people can have a little different task, and we want to merge inside the society and build some kind of espionage nets inside Europe too. We have to be very, very fragile about who is crossing the border, and that kind of group of the people have to be under supervision by the NATO and European Union structures.
That's a fascinating answer, JJ. Thanks for that uniquely, Polish perspective. And for those of you who are on his last comment, what countries are visa free, right? For Russians to flee, it's, Georgia, Armenia, Turkey. If you're looking at the numbers of those countries right now, it's quite large, whereas countries like the Baltics have shut off those flows as well. So another note on Poland, just here on this side of the Atlantic, we like to talk about our support, which has been strong, right? HIMARS and other things. But, Poland population 39 million has taken in almost 3 million refugees. That's 10% of the population. So if you're out there, just think about the impact on just the raw waves of humans coming into Poland, and it's been impressive to watch how Poland has opened their arms and absorbed this amount of refugees and said this is our fight too. So appreciate your thoughts on that. We're going to close out with a speed round, and then we'll end our session here. We're a little over time, but it's okay. We got some extra time allocated here. The speed round I'd like to do is, what indicators are you three seeing on either the Russian side or the Ukrainian side that we, the unwashed masses out here, should be looking at in order to, prognosticate or understand what's going on? What indicators are you looking at, either, in terms of Russian strength or collapse, or let's say, on the Ukraine side? I'll start with Dr. Marsh. I'll go to JJ, and then close out with you, Dr. Stringer.
The indicators I'm looking for, and I've been focusing on all along, are popular support for Putin and regime support for him from the elites. I disagree a little bit with what Dr. Stringer said. I shouldn't say disagree. I'm more hopeful that a regime change is possible, and that Kadyrov or someone of his like would not come to power, but that if the people stay mobilized, as they've been mobilized just recently, that they will stay home and start popular protests and have a regime change that leads to a genuine change in the nature of the government. I don't want to go on longer. I would go on, just keep ranting, but those are the things I'm looking for. You know, the support for the Putin government and what it stands for, and the Slovakia and those people who are in power and supporting Putin in power, and how if that's going to shift, if that can change. I'll stop there. Over.
Yeah, great comments. JJ, over to you. What indicators on either the Ukraine or the Russian side should we be looking at?
First of all, if we can, we have to be patient, because the indicators cannot show up quickly. That would be a long time. We have to see some kind of indicators. If you ask me about my personal opinion about what kind of indicators I am looking for, first of all, just like during the engagement of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, we cannot overestimate the power of the Russian wives and women and the mothers. So it doesn't matter who is leading this country. If we see the protest of the thousands of women on the street who ask, where is my son, where is my husband, and what's going on, and I'm not going to send my second son or to the front line, that will be the beginning. The same happened during the Solidarity in Poland in 1980s. And that time we have to start to support this kind of activity in Russia. I don't know which way, there are specialists about it, but I think that would be effective to support this kind of internal small movement, just like United States and Westerners did in Poland in 1980s during the Solidarity movement. I remember that this time as a teenager, and I remember how we saw the American support in Poland across the Catholic churches. The movement of Solidarity was strong because our Solidarity leaders, but also the external support. External support was on time and was permanent and in long term. That was the effect on 1989 when the communists collapsed and was started in Poland as well. So I'm looking for some kind of social movement inside in Russia, and trigger will be women. Thank you.
Oh, fascinating. Yep, man, you put your finger right on that. Thank you, JJ, for that. Dr. Stringer, to you.
Right, I'm looking at two indicators. The first indicator, I'm following closely open source information that will indicate strange action, sabotage that will occur either in the occupied territories in Ukraine or potentially in Russia. We've had some explosions, people killed, things going on in Crimea, for example. I'll be watching for that going forward, especially now we've had the annexation. What's happening and it's getting reported upon. So that's probably one indicator. It's a bit more resistance focused, but nevertheless, it might indicate a Russian resistance to the regime or Ukrainian action. So indicator one. The other indicator, I actually look at Russian activities outside of this theater of operations. I'm watching also what they're doing with China and Africa in particular. And are they drawing back? Are they doing something to distract? That also might lead to some lines of inquiry that could be useful about continued Russian will or inability to do something, having to move forces, proxies, assets back and forth between various places they're engaged. Back over to you.
Yeah, fascinating. Look, thanks. Those were I wrote down all the indicators from you three. So I appreciate you giving us those thoughts. With that, I want to thank you three for taking your time in the afternoon in Poland and in Switzerland and in the morning in Tampa for coming onto this panel and sharing your thoughts with us. Good to see you. Good to see you, teammates, and good to see you folks out there, many of whom I know, and appreciate your time. Again, yeah, I think Clarissa is putting up there, these opinions expressed are, not necessarily representative of, the governments, NATO, et cetera. You got the standard disclaimer. We appreciate the, the open academic flow of the morning, and I know I learned a lot. So with that, either Dr. Burrell or Clarissa, I will turn it over to you if there's anything I missed in the clean sweep here today.
Thank you, Brian. Much appreciated. I just wanted to remind the audience that this panel will be posted to the ThinkJSOU YouTube channel, and it could be found in approximately 1 week. And many of our other productions are also there for you to access whenever is convenient. If you have questions, concerns, or comments, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu. We appreciate your attendance, your thought-provoking questions, and your support. Thank you again, and ThinkJSOU.